We are privileged now to hear from Dr. Kathryn Witt. Kay Witt is another friend of ECHO. She is eminently qualified, again, both in practice and in theory. She is chair of the Department of Nutrition and Dietetics at Messiah, and she is participating in a lot of research studies. I was interested to note on the web that one of the ones that they've just released has to do with nutrition of college students. And I imagine that was a rather interesting study to undertake. But she has a real passion, and besides her knowledge of nutrition and community health, one of the reasons that we were so interested in her sharing with us is she looks at this nexus of ways to look at the resources, beliefs, and nutritional health of communities and figure out how to bring improvement in that context, but respecting all these different dynamics that are at play. And I hope that one of the themes you will hear over these days is if you ignore these kinds of dynamics, you are going to relegate yourself to frustration and ineffectiveness. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Kathryn Witt.
Thanks, David. Hello. Isn't it a blessing to be here? I just feel so encouraged. And I have to be honest with you and tell you that I'm also really intimidated. Not just because I normally don't speak to this many people. Our classes at Messiah are pretty small. But because what you do really matters. It really matters in advancing God's kingdom, and it really matters for helping the poor. And I'm a little nervous about giving you the best information that I can, so that you can go out and serve all around the world. And so if what you need isn't in my talk, I'll invite you to come seek me out at some point later. What I've tried to do in this talk is to put together many of the questions that I've been asked, either on the phone or by email or in person, about how to incorporate Moringa with what I guess I would call Community Nutrition 101, tools for investigating the nutritional health of a community, and then for designing interventions which will be sustainable and effective and long-lasting. So here we go. All right, when I began to think about how to approach this, I realized that this topic really deserves something more like a 3-day workshop than a 45-minute talk. And I did what I usually do as a professor. I made a handout. And so I'm going to try and cover some of the more global themes that I think we all need to be aware of. And I put a lot of the information about the details, or where you can get them, on a handout. There's some handouts kind of distributed throughout the room. I left some more at the information table. And so if you have a pile of handouts in front of you, if you would pass those down your row, and we'll try and make sure everybody can have one. I won't be referring to the handout a lot during my talk, but one of the wonderful things about the world we live in today is that there's a lot of the information about the details is available free online. And that's what that handout has. It has some of the tools that you can download as you're trying to do this in your communities all around the world well. So what's community nutrition assessment? It's trying to understand the nutritional strengths and weaknesses of a community with the aim of being able to help that community address its weaknesses in particular. And as I began to think about this, I thought about this image we sometimes see for complex issues, in that it's a little bit like unpeeling an onion. To really understand the nutritional status of a community. There are some things we can see pretty readily just looking at the outside, but for some other more important things, we really have to dig deep and kind of peel back slowly, layer by layer. I think it's also true that this process is sometimes long and frustrating and may engender tears, as an onion does as well. And so what I'd like to do in the beginning here is just to kind of peel back some of these layers, and as I do so, to talk about some of the tools that you can use to better understand the communities in which you live and serve. Okay. I want to begin with what's probably the easiest layer to see, and that is some of the health and nutrition outcomes of a community. And I can get an idea for many areas of the world of this just from my desk in Grantham, Pennsylvania. because a lot of statistics related to this sort of more superficial layer are readily available. One place to start in this layer are the rates of illness and death in your region of the world from a variety of diseases. Diseases increase nutrient needs, and malnutrition increases the rate and severity of diseases. And by knowing which diseases are bigger problems in your community, you can be a little bit better tuned into which nutrients you might want to pay more attention to. So here are some of the diseases that are more commonly problems in developing countries. There's a list of them up there. I don't need to read them for you. Where you can find some of this information is the World Health Organization maintains a fairly substantial database. And you can get maps, which are kind of general, but you can also dig down into particular regions of specific countries and find out rates of some of these various diseases in the community in which you live. You also may have access to a local health clinic. And many local health clinics have begun to keep lists of who is coming with specific diseases. And this also might alert you to what some of the main health conditions are in your community. The next thing I want to talk about is something I think a lot of people have questions about, and it's child growth as a tool for understanding the nutritional health of a community. In some ways, the growth of children is kind of like a canary in a coal mine. If a community's nutritional health is not strong, the growth of children is something that one can notice rather readily and understand then that there is a problem. And in particular, the growth of children from birth through age 5, probably with a specific interest in birth through age 2, is where most of the international work is done in this regard. There's a lot of different statistics and a lot of different measures that are used to assess child growth. The picture I put on the overhead is one of the World Health Organization growth charts for girls. These are relatively easy to interpret, and you can plot any child's growth and see how it compares to what's considered normal growth. That is, it's an international standard for what is considered normal growth. Some countries have adapted this a bit more specifically for the racial and ethnic groups that predominate there. But no matter where you are in the world, you're pretty safe using the World Health Organization standards. I put a list of the more commonly used standards in child nutrition assessment up on the slide. And the two that you're going to see most often are weight for length for a little one who can't stand yet, or height for a child who can stand, and then the child's length for their age. Children who are low in length in weight for length or height are considered to be wasted. That's just the lingo that's used to distinguish that from kids who have a small length for their age, and that's called stunting. The reason this distinction is important is that when a child is becoming malnourished, their weight for their height will drop first. And so if you're tracking an individual child, you can kind of tell first that they're falling away from this pattern on the chart. And then if the malnutrition continues, you will then begin to see their height or length for their age drop away as well. And so if you have a lot of wasted children, you would expect to see that early in a nutrition emergency. Children who are stunted are more typical of communities with chronic malnutrition. Some of the other measures I put up there, mid-upper arm circumference involves taking a tape measure and putting around the kind of the middle of the upper part of the arm. There are international standards for this measurement. It's inexpensive to obtain, and it is often used in emergency situations to try and assess the nutritional status of a community. I also put body mass index on there. We use that a little bit more for adults to assess both over and under nutrition. But it can be used for children as well. I want to spend a little more time talking about the resources. The World Health Organization website for child growth standards has a lot of really terrific resources for learning how to do these measurements. What equipment should you buy? How often should you do it? How many people should you do? How should you plot children on this chart? In addition, you can download a software program where if you go out and measure a sample of children in your community and then put it into the software database, it will actually show you how the children of your community compare to what would be considered ideal. for any one of these measures. And so all of that is available. If you have internet access, you can download all of that. There's manuals, great color pictures for assessing the nutritional status of children in this way. Another manual I think is helpful is a manual that the World Food Program and the U.S. Centers for Disease Control put up. Whereas the World Health Organization Child Growth Standards Manual is much more about how do you do this, how do you take the measurements. One thing that the second manual I mentioned has is, okay, so how many children should you measure to really get an idea of what the nutritional status of your community? So there's a little bit more stats and technical things of that nature in that second manual, sampling procedures and that sort of thing that I think might be helpful to you. A third thing in this sort of superficial first layer is other signs of nutrient deficiencies that we can see. I put pictures of a few of these on here, but my intent in this presentation is not to make you experts in looking at people and determining their nutritional status. I'm really going to refer you here to the trained healthcare providers in your community. But some of these things that you might see are edema or swelling, and that sometimes happens in a protein deficiency. Anemia you really can't see, although you sometimes can see a pale color. Very common nutrition problem worldwide, often related to an iron deficiency, but it could also be caused by a protein deficiency or a deficiency of several of our B vitamins. And then we have night blindness, which is an inability to see in dim light. I'm curious, has anybody here ever done a night blindness screening? It's kind of a fun thing to do. In areas of the world where vitamin A is a problem, it's a pretty simple test where you put people in a darkened room, flash a bright light, and give them a reading, kind of a vision test. And people who don't have enough vitamin A will have trouble seeing in that dim light. So again, a relatively low-cost procedure. And you can find directions for doing that in some of these manuals. Something that you might notice is another eye problem called xerophthalmia, which just means really dry eyes. This is not the same as the Restasis commercials if you live in North America, and you're probably sick of seeing those commercials. This is a different kind of problem where the cells that create the fluid that lubricate our eyes are not able to do their job well anymore, and the eyes can become scratched and infected and develop scar tissue, which causes permanent blindness. Not something we think about if you're here in North America, where the leading cause of blindness is actually diabetes. But in developing countries, it's vitamin A deficiency, and the xerophthalmia that can result. Another thing you might notice if you live in an area where the iodine in the soil is low, and there is no fortification program in place, is goiter from a lack of iodine. And that's the big lump on the neck. And again, all of these things can be caused by a variety of medical conditions. And so I would consult with a local healthcare provider before you kind of jump to action on the basis of seeing some of these things. So that's the first layer. Now let's look a little bit deeper. Oops, let's try again. There we go. What are some of the diet and health behaviors that underlie some of these rates of disease and illness that we observe? I really started to scratch my head when I thought about this, because you're from all over the world, and people all around the world have very different dietary patterns and very different taste preferences. And it's important to work within whatever the taste and cultural heritage of your community is. This is the best resources I could think of to share with you. The Food and Agriculture Organization has a webpage with food-based dietary guidelines that is recommended food-based dietary patterns for various regions of the world. Now, many developing countries don't have the resources to have created their very own, but often you can find resources from maybe a country next door or a country with a similar cultural group. And this will give you recommended amounts of traditional foods that should adequately nourish a human community. And so I'll invite you sometime to check out this website, and you could look at all the different things that people eat all around the world. It's really amazing. And that web address is in the handout for you. So if you're trying to decide, well, what should people be eating here? I mean, I grew up in New Jersey. So when I went to Burkina Faso, I was completely unfamiliar with pretty much anything they were eating. And I needed a place to get started. I think this will be helpful. Secondly, because young children are an important emphasis in this work, I wanted to point out to you some resources for better understanding the recommended guidelines for feeding young children, especially at the time of weaning, which would generally start at about 6 months and maybe go through about the first 2 years of life. The World Health Organization has put quite a lot of emphasis on this time, as if you look at the growth of children, it's in those first 2-3 years of life that children from communities that lack resources tend to really fall away from what's considered normal human growth. So what are the sort of primary emphasis in checking to see if people are feeding young children well? Well, breast milk is such a wonderfully nutrient-rich, immunoglobulin-rich substance to feed kids that the first guideline is, when at all possible, breastfeed children exclusively for the first 6 months of their life and continue doing so for at least 2 years. Now, if you grew up in North America and you've been working here, that might seem somewhat different than what's typical here. In most developing countries, 2 years is pretty typical, so that's not going to sound quite so unusual in the setting of a developing country. In fact, it saves the lives of lots of children to have mother's milk instead of a substitute, which isn't quite as good nutritionally and definitely isn't as good immunologically. Other things that parents may need to be reminded of are to feed in what the WHO calls responsive feeding. It means pay attention to your child. For really young children, feed them directly. And for kids who are a little older, supervise and make sure that they're getting the food you intend them to get, and that perhaps an older sibling isn't coming along and swiping it from someone who's too young to kind of fight for their own place at the table. Additional concerns are that people have a way to prepare food safely, to store food safely, and that they learn good food preparation techniques. Very simple things like hand washing can make a life-saving difference in the context of a kitchen, which is usually out in the open air. Other things, if you've raised children, probably seem kind of self-explanatory, but children need more food in addition to breast milk as they age. Their breast milk consumption will naturally drop off, and they'll need to begin to have more calories from the other foods in their diet. Kids at 6 months who first begin to eat other foods don't necessarily need jarred baby food. Home mashed foods that are soft are fine. I mean, usually by about a year of age, children can eat what most of the rest of the family eats. And so some families need to just be aware that, what's appropriate to give very young children. In addition to that, kids need to eat more frequently than adults, and not everybody is aware of that. Most children are going to need to eat 3, 4, 5, 6 times a day, even for really little ones, in order to be able to get all the nutrients they need. And there's some interesting work in a few countries where the diet is very, very heavy in a starchy staple, where they staple food, where researchers said, okay, here's the size of a child's stomach, and here's how many calories the staple food typically has, and let's see how much volume of that food a child would need. And they've actually kind of done a bit of math and estimated how often a child would need to eat in a day in order to come up with some of these numbers. And particularly in countries where there's a lot of fiber, a lot of starch, maybe not quite so much protein in the diet, children need to eat more frequently than adults do. The next guideline really could be a 45-minute talk in itself, and it's about, so what kind of foods do we feed children? What variety is optimal? And rather than taking your time to attempt to do that now with the whole world in mind, I want to refer you to this manual that is, it's called Complementary Feeding. And it's a wonderfully simple but accurate manual. Written for the context of developing countries with exercises and tools for you to explore what the common ways of feeding young children are, and ways perhaps then to incorporate foods that might provide Missing Nutrients. This is just a terrific manual. You can download it free on the web. Two things I think will come, well, one thing we'll come back to later is that in some populations, the food resources are lean enough that it might be important to think about supplements, especially for pregnant women, for breastfeeding women, and for young children. This is a big area of kind of discussion, research, and controversy right now. And obviously where I'm going with this talk is, well, what about the use of moringa as, or Moringa oleifera leaves as a nutrient supplement? The last point is that some cultures are inclined not to feed children who are ill, just because of the cultural heritage, the beliefs that they have. And for most illnesses, that's not such a good idea. And so it's important to get the word out. And health care providers are generally doing this, is that to continue to give kids at least fluids and perhaps food as well when they are not feeling well. In addition to some of these more nutrition-related things, I think it's important to keep nutrition in context and realize that all of these other things are going to impact the nutritional health of the children and the community as a whole. Are there immunizations available? If they are, do people take advantage of them? Are there even immunization records so that you can tell if a child has been immunized? Many governments provide either fortified foods. For example, in the United States, we fortify milk with vitamin D. We add iodine to salt. And sometimes people have access to those. Some governments provide supplements like vitamin A gel caps that can be used maybe once or twice a year. And you want to find out, are these available? Hopefully they're not just sitting in a warehouse someplace. Are they getting out to the people who need them? And do people use them? I think physical activity level is important, maybe more so for women than it is for children. Kids kind of run around and play no matter what, particularly when they don't have a lot of digital devices to keep them seated and busy. But I think especially for women who may often be walking miles for water or firewood, the amount of physical activity level that's just a part of what they have to do over the course of the day is an important thing to think about. And if you're in a community where the physical activity of the adults is pretty strenuous, now you might, and you're from North America, they might need to eat more than you're kind of thinking an adult needs to eat. Next, does the community have child growth monitoring equipment? Is it used regularly? Are the records something that's in a useful form and that children can be tracked so that if a child does begin to falter, someone can kind of take a look at what's going on in that family and see if an intervention can take place at the individual level before the child's health declines further. And then a whole variety of other things that are important for the health of the family as a whole. In malaria endemic areas, are people using, do they have mosquito treated nets for mosquitoes? Do they have antiretroviral or anti-malarial medications available? And if so, do they use them? All of these things will be important for impacting nutrition, not just food itself. What I want to get to next are some of the deeper levels, and I really want to reiterate what our last speaker said about the importance of really learning not just about a community, but learning in the context of that community and learning with that community about the history and some of their beliefs related to food and nutrition. Here's some of the things that people have shared with me in the past that are important to learn about. Pregnancy and childbearing are sort of a wondrous and mysterious process, and lots of cultures have very deeply held, but often quite private beliefs about what is appropriate for a pregnant woman to eat, for a breastfeeding woman to eat, what's appropriate to feed a young child. And these may not be things that are shared readily. It often takes a lot of patient listening to get to the level in a community where these are shared, especially if the community perceives you as someone who might think what they do is silly. They'll be even more reticent to share what's really going on behind closed doors about feeding. I don't know. I think if we went around the room, there's enough people of different ages here that, when do you start feeding a child solid foods? I know when I was a baby, there was sort of a race, and whoever could get their child to consume solid foods early enough, and that was sort of some sign of, I don't know, child intelligence or parenting prowess or something. And kids were fed solid foods very early. It turns out that kids aren't particularly ready to digest and absorb a lot of the things in many solids very early, and it's especially true in environments where perhaps the water's not so great, the food sanitation's not so great. The current recommendation is to wait until 6 months to start introducing solid foods. And in a lot of cultures, people think that's silly. When we started to feed our children, my grandmothers thought it was silly. Like, why on earth would you wait so long before doing that? And so sometimes there are things in the culture that you need to be aware of, and people might not be doing what you want them to do, and you think, well, why? It's often something that just hasn't been shared, and you need to figure out yet. Okay. I think the last thing on my list I'll just talk about a little bit is in the context of family life, what are the priorities for distributing food, which becomes really important if there's not much food available. Is it the men and the boys who get priority? When do the women and the children get to eat? And how is that provided? Occasionally, little children just aren't able to compete very well for food resources. And even though it seems like maybe they should be enough, or they may even start with a bowl, maybe by the end of the mealtime, they haven't really been able to consume it. So that's also something that you want to look at. Going just a little bit deeper are beliefs about health and health care. For example, why do people get sick? From a kind of a modern medical standpoint, I'm thinking about pathogens and maybe oxidative damage and other kinds of things. Well, some people would think first about ancestral spirits, or something I did wrong and this is punishment. And if you're in a culture where that's the idea that people have, some of these sort of more Western or European ideas about ways to address illness won't make much sense to them. Like, what difference does it make if I eat something different? Because that's not why I got sick in the first place. So it's important to learn about how your community feels about illness, and then also about healing. So if somebody is sick, what do you do? Do you go to a traditional healer? Do you go to the traditional healer and the health clinic? Do you work together? Ideally, there's kind of a partnership that's formed, and folks can have the best of both worlds. But that doesn't always happen. And so you might want to explore what is going on in your community. I was a little surprised that I grew up in New Jersey. I live in Pennsylvania. I'm kind of embarrassed to stand up here and be talking to all of you with experience from all over the world. I got to spend several weeks in Burkina Faso and really had my eyes open to all of the different ways in the world that people think about health. And it never occurred to me that someone would think of an immunization as kind of a magic potion. And that's how it worked. I just never thought about it in that context. Or that a nutrition supplement would work by magic. I was like, oh. But that's really what people think in a lot of places. And so if you want to do education and you want to make some kind of an intervention, you need to understand where they're coming from and work with them to develop solutions together. This last kind of, we're kind of down to the middle of the onion. And I think some of the agricultural things I'm not at all qualified to speak about, and so I won't. Some of the spiritual things I think most of you have seen in communities that you work in, spiritual things about where does health and healing come from. In addition, I think Christianity gives us an optimism and a hope that people who don't share the gift of faith have. And so sometimes we approach problems a little bit more differently. I also think that there are health behaviors that make sense in the climate and resources of a particular region of the world that may seem almost kooky to someone who maybe grew up in Europe or North America. And I'll give you one example. In some parts of the world, pregnant women are pretty much undereat. They won't eat protein-rich foods, for example, because even though they're available, because it's just thought not to be so good for pregnant women. And I thought, that is the kookiest thing. Until I realized, I talked to a friend who's a nurse, grew up in Zambia, and said, well, if you eat more, women eat more, they'll have bigger babies. And if you're having bigger babies out in the bush where there's no C-section, then mom dies. And when mom dies, the whole family has no provider. And so maybe it makes sense that people are willing to have the risk of a smaller baby against the risk of losing mom. Oh, yeah, I never thought of it that way. But these are the kinds of things you want to discover before you go further and attempt to design interventions. All right. That was my lecture on the importance of really digging into your community and learning with them. A little bit about environment, and this is the area I'm really not qualified to speak about. I put 3 pictures up on the slide. One is the Center for the Advancement of the Handicapped in Mahadaga, Burkina Faso, a very dry place. The middle picture is the community garden in Grantham, Pennsylvania, about 1,000 miles north of here. Actually, today, the temperature is almost as warm as it is here, but normally quite a bit cooler. We cannot grow moringa well here. And then the bottom is where we are today, perhaps a place that's got more rainfall than would be typical in Burkina Faso. And I just want to say that you want to, I'm speaking about nutrition only, but you really want to check with the ECHO folks about will it grow, can it be stored, can it be dried, what would be the best ways for doing that. And I've put references to some of ECHO's technical notes in the handout, but you also might just want to take advantage of the agriculture experts that are here while you are here and ask your questions about that. Okay, next. So what about using the leaves of this remarkably hardy tree native to India, which is, and the leaves are quite nutrient rich. When are the best situations in which to begin an intervention with moringa? And what are the things that you can do to make it more likely that the community will accept and that this will be a sustainable intervention? First, kind of a quick overview. On the slide, I put the nutrients that are most commonly low in human diets in under-resourced communities. Iron is the most common nutrient deficiency worldwide. Zinc is receiving a lot of new research attention, both in terms of immune protection and growth. Vitamin C is also sort of new on the radar screen. I'm sorry, vitamin B6 is new on the radar screen. Vitamin C is not. Vitamin A has been recognized as a problem for a long time. Calcium is a problem in many communities, not all, but many. And vitamin C also in some, but not all. And the last point on the slide I brought up earlier, in some places, if foods are combined carefully, there's enough nutrients in the environment, but maybe young children have trouble consuming enough in order to be able to meet their needs. Well, before we talk about moringa specifically, I wanted to put it in the context of all of the different kinds of things you might think of to do once you identify the nutritional challenges in your community. So here they are. You could increase consumption of foods that have the nutrients that people need. Animal products are rich in a lot of the nutrients that are lacking, but they're relatively expensive and costly and may be challenging for some families to maintain. Dark green or orange fruits and vegetables for vitamin A. Moringa leaves is another food you might introduce for vitamin A. In addition to doing some of this, you might consider home food processing methodologies that help to better release the nutrients in food, make it easier for us to digest and absorb them. Some of these processes also will knock down the numbers of pathogens in food, something like roasting. And they also may make sort of some of the starchy foods that are quite hard for young children to digest, more liquid and easier for the children to get the nutrients out of. So that's a whole other category. And ECHO's done some work there as well. Fortification is adding nutrients to foods, like adding iodine to salt. That happens. That's another option. Supplements is an option. Vitamin A capsules is an example of that. Somewhat newer are packets of what are called sprinkles containing vitamin A and iron and zinc. These are sold commercially. My interest has been, can moringa leaf powder be incorporated as a supplement into the diet? And I couldn't just talk about nutrition alone. I had to put infection control matters when it comes to nutrient needs. And so one way you can improve the nutritional status of a community actually is hygiene, immunizations, controlling infections also has an important role. Well, if you do a Google search and you do moringa and nutrition and you limit it to images, you'll get a screen full of images. And a lot of them are somewhat similar. So I picked some of the more common ones. And when I looked at this as a nutritionist, one of the things that puzzled me some is it doesn't really ever say how much. There's just these really kind of miraculous comparisons about the nutrient content of moringa. And it's true, moringa is a nutrient-rich plant. But I do want to say two things about some of these images. One, when chemists do chemical analysis of foods, they tend to report their results in 100 grams per 100 grams of a food. It's just what chemists do. But people don't eat foods 100 grams at a time. And in fact, most of us don't even have a good sense of what 100 grams of a lot of things is. So what is 100 grams of moringa? It's roughly a liter of kind of loosely packed fresh leaves. It's a lot. It's roughly maybe 260 mils of leaf powder. And so these are correct, but they may just not represent how much moringa we're actually likely to consume at a given point in time. A few of these are also based on some data from the early 1950s. And as our knowledge of nutrient needs and how different plant compounds contribute to those needs has changed a bit, some of this is now a bit out of date. And so what I wanted to do is provide you with something that I think is a bit more up to date and perhaps a little bit more practical. So if we were able to convince a family to add a tablespoon of moringa powder to what a child was eating, maybe twice a day, morning and evening, what kind of nutrients would that provide them? And in the image I've got up here, the left-hand spoon is a little Nescafe spoon. The middle spoon is kind of like the spoons we had at breakfast. And the big spoon is an American tablespoon, roughly 15 mils. So 2 of these a day still provides quite a bit of nutritional benefit, about the same amount of vitamin C as half a small orange. I mean, that's not a small amount. And you can look at the other comparisons, about a 1/4 cup of carrots, about a cup of the calcium for a cup of milk. In terms of protein, about a 1/4 cup of yogurt or 40 mils of soybeans. And in terms of iron, fairly comparable to a serving of beans or peanuts or spinach. And so moringa leaves may not be quite as miraculous as some of the images on the web suggest, but they are nutrient rich. And the value of the dried powder is that it can be preserved and used as a supplement, especially in the lean season.